Write a geopolitical assessment in a warning-driven, realist, and historically grounded tone. In the early hours of a winter morning, far from the Caribbean Sea, an event unfolded that quietly redefined the balance of credibility in global politics. What many observers initially treated as a legal maneuver or a political shock carried a deeper strategic meaning. It exposed the distance between ambition and capability, between rhetoric and reality. When a major power speaks about global responsibility, partnership, and protection, the real test does not come during summits or speeches. It comes when a partner is under direct pressure and expects more than words. Venezuela became such a test. For years, Beijing had framed its relationship with Caracas as proof that Chinese influence had crossed oceans and hemispheres. Loans, energy cooperation, diplomatic symbolism, all were presented as pillars of a durable alliance. Yet, when the crisis escalated rapidly and decisively, the response from China remained cautious, procedural, and restrained. No visible strategic move followed. No credible deterrent emerged. This moment matters not because it humiliates any side, but because it reveals how power actually works in the international system. Realism teaches that power is not declared, it is demonstrated, and demonstration depends on logistics, geography, and sustained reach. In Washington, the message was not spoken but understood. In Beijing, the calculation was likely cold and uncomfortable. Distance still imposes limits. Oceans still matter. Naval power is not symbolic steel, but fuel maintenance, supply chains, and safe passage. The world has entered an era where crises are fast, information is instant, and expectations of action rise quickly. But material constraints do not vanish just because narratives change. Venezuela, in this sense, was not an isolated case. It was a mirror, a reflection of what global power projection truly requires and what happens when aspiration runs ahead of infrastructure. The question for the audience is not who was right or wrong. The question is simpler and more unsettling. When the next crisis comes, who can actually act and who can only speak? To understand why responses remained limited, one must begin with geography, the most unforgiving variable in geopolitics. From the eastern coastline of China to the shores of Venezuela lies one of the longest possible maritime distances on Earth. Any naval force attempting to bridge that gap must cross multiple strategic theaters, each with its own risks and constraints. This is not a matter of speed or courage. It is a matter of endurance. Aircraft carriers are often described as floating symbols of national prestige, but in reality they are among the most logistics-dependent instruments ever created. They consume enormous quantities of fuel. They require constant maintenance. Their aircraft depend on secure storage, spare parts, and uninterrupted supply lines. Without these elements, a carrier is not a spear but a burden. China's early generation carriers were designed primarily for regional operations, close to home waters where support is guaranteed. Extending their presence across two oceans would require a global network of bases, friendly ports, and protected sea lanes. Such a network does not yet exist. Even assuming perfect planning, the journey alone would stretch operational limits before any mission could begin. And every mile traveled increases exposure to surveillance, tracking, and diplomatic pressure. Geography also introduces chokepoints, narrow passages where movement can be monitored or restricted. These are not theoretical obstacles. They are permanent features of the map. History is filled with examples of great powers whose ambitions collapsed not in battle, but in supply failure. From ancient empires to modern wars, logistics has repeatedly decided outcomes long before weapons were fired. In the case of Venezuela, the distance transformed political support into a strategic dilemma. Acting forcefully would risk overextension. Remaining passive would reveal limits. Faced with that choice, restraint becomes rational. This does not signal weakness of intent, but recognition of reality. Power projection is cumulative. It is built over decades, not announced overnight. Until geography is matched with infrastructure, influence remains uneven. And uneven influence produces hesitation when crises erupt far from home. Public perception often lags behind structural reality, especially when it comes to military power. Over the past decade, images of new warships, carrier launches, and naval parades have shaped a narrative of rapid transformation. To many observers, this suggested the arrival of a truly global navy. But a navy's true strength is not measured by hulls alone. It is measured by how far, how long, and how safely those hulls can operate when politics turns hostile. A global navy requires more than ships. It requires a dense web of overseas logistics, intelligence sharing, diplomatic access, and crisis management experience. These elements are invisible to most audiences, yet decisive in practice. The United States built such a system gradually through alliances, basing agreements, and repeated deployments across multiple theaters. China's naval expansion, by contrast, has been largely regionally optimized. Its strengths are formidable close to home, where supply lines are short and political control is strong. Beyond that zone, capacity thins quickly. Overseas facilities remain limited. Commercial ports cannot fully substitute for military bases during high-tension scenarios. In a Western Hemisphere crisis, any Chinese naval presence would operate under constant observation, with limited room for maneuver. This creates escalation risks that prudent strategists seek to avoid. In this context, restraint is not embarrassment, it is calculation. The gap between image and capability is not unique to China. History shows that many rising powers encounter this phase, where ambition races ahead of institutional depth. The danger lies not in acknowledging limits, but in ignoring them. Venezuela highlighted this gap with unusual clarity. It showed that global presence is not declared through partnerships alone, but earned through sustained, costly investment in reach and resilience. Until that gap closes, influence will remain selective, not universal. As naval planners know, the most decisive battles are often never fought. They are settled quietly at narrow passages where geography compresses power into vulnerability. Strategic chokepoints do not need missiles to assert control. They only require authority, surveillance, and political alignment. In any transoceanic deployment toward the Western Hemisphere, these chokepoints become unavoidable tests. The Panama Canal stands as the most obvious example, not merely as an engineering marvel but as a geopolitical filter. Control over transit rights translates directly into strategic leverage. For any fleet seeking rapid redeployment between oceans, denial or delay is enough to derail timelines, disrupt logistics, and expose intent. Even the possibility of restricted passage forces planners to calculate alternatives that are far longer, far riskier, and far more expensive. Sailing around South America is not just a matter of distance. It means harsher seas, prolonged strain on crews, accelerated wear on vessels, and continuous exposure to monitoring. Every additional day at sea multiplies logistical demand. Fuel consumption rises, maintenance windows shrink. Operational readiness declines before a mission even begins. In such conditions, the fleet arrives not as a decisive instrument, but as a constrained presence. Chokepoints therefore function as silent enforcers of the existing order. They favor those who already possess global infrastructure and penalize those still building it. This reality explains why restraint often replaces confrontation. Escalation through force projection becomes irrational when access itself is uncertain. The power to deny movement can be more influential than the power to destroy. Venezuela demonstrated this principle without spectacle. No blockade was announced. No fleet was turned back publicly. Yet the strategic environment spoke clearly. Geography did the work. The absence of movement became the message. In modern geopolitics, silence at a choke point can be louder than any show of force. When military options narrow, diplomacy moves to the forefront. But diplomacy is only effective when it is backed by credible leverage. Without that foundation, it risks becoming repetitive language detached from outcomes. In the Venezuela crisis, official statements emphasized sovereignty, non-interference, and international law. These phrases were familiar, carefully calibrated, and procedurally correct. Yet what mattered most was not what was said, but what could not be done. There were no meaningful economic counters announced. No coordinated pressure mechanisms activated. No visible shift in strategic posture. This was not moral hesitation, it was structural limitation. Realist theory explains that states do not choose freely among all options. They choose among feasible ones. When leverage is limited, signaling becomes conservative by necessity. Diplomatic language then serves a defensive function. It preserves relationships. It avoids escalation. It buys time. But it does not alter trajectories. In Washington and other capitals, this distinction is understood intuitively. Words without follow-through are cataloged, not feared. This does not diminish the importance of diplomacy as a tool. It clarifies its boundaries. Diplomacy amplifies power. It cannot substitute for it. The Venezuela episode revealed how quickly diplomatic posture is constrained when distant interests collide with hard geography. Supportive rhetoric did not translate into deterrence because the underlying balance did not support it. This creates a reputational effect that extends beyond a single case. Partners begin to reassess expectations. Adversaries recalibrate risk. None of this requires confrontation. It emerges organically from observation. The lesson is uncomfortable, but consistent across history. Influence sustained only by language erodes under pressure. Influence supported by capacity shapes outcomes quietly. Venezuela placed this contrast under a spotlight, forcing every observer to reconsider the difference between alignment and protection. It would be a mistake to view Venezuela as a unique anomaly. In reality, it functioned as a controlled stress test, revealing how power behaves at the edge of its reach. The dynamics observed here are likely to repeat wherever strategic commitments extend beyond established infrastructure. This is not a judgment of intention or legitimacy. It is an observation about capacity. Rising powers often accumulate influence faster than they consolidate reach. Investments, partnerships, and political symbolism create an impression of global presence. But when pressure intensifies, the difference between presence and protection becomes stark. Venezuela showed how quickly that distinction surfaces. When events accelerate, there is little time to build new capabilities. Only what already exists can be used. This has implications far beyond Latin America. It affects how commitments are interpreted across regions where influence is aspirational rather than institutionalized. It also shapes internal debates. Strategic planners must decide whether to slow expansion, deepen infrastructure, or accept selective engagement. Each path carries cost and risk. Overextension has historically been more damaging than restraint. Empires collapse not because they lack ambition, but because they exceed logistical coherence. The prudent response to such a test is not denial, but adaptation. Power that acknowledges limits can grow sustainably. Power that ignores them invites strategic shock. Venezuela provided a clear data point in that calculation. It reminded the international system that global power is not a slogan. It is a supply chain. Until reach and resilience align, influence will remain uneven, and crisis will continue to expose that reality without warning. As the discussion widens beyond a single crisis, attention inevitably turns to the structure of the international order itself. Events like Venezuela force an uncomfortable but necessary examination of how international law actually functions when power is uneven. Legal principles exist, treaties are signed, institutions convene, yet enforcement depends almost entirely on capability. This is not a moral claim. It is a structural reality that has persisted since the modern state system emerged. Sovereignty is often described as absolute, but in practice it operates within boundaries shaped by power, geography, and political will. When enforcement mechanisms are blocked or paralyzed, states with sufficient reach act according to their interpretation of security and responsibility, while others respond through statements and appeals. This dynamic creates a recurring pattern. Law becomes language, power becomes action. The resulting tension fuels global debate but rarely changes immediate outcomes. Venezuela highlighted this imbalance with unusual clarity. Competing narratives emerged quickly, each grounded in legal reasoning, historical precedent, or moral framing. Yet the decisive factor was not whose argument was more eloquent. It was who possessed the capacity to shape facts on the ground. This does not invalidate international law, it exposes its dependency. Law restrains power most effectively when power is distributed or mutually constrained. When it is not, law becomes a forum for contestation rather than resolution. For rising powers, this creates a strategic dilemma. Calling for strict adherence to sovereignty while lacking enforcement capacity risks revealing asymmetry. Challenging that asymmetry prematurely risks escalation without advantage. The safer path is often rhetorical consistency paired with operational caution. This may appear passive, but it is frequently deliberate. History suggests that systems evolve slowly, through accumulation rather than confrontation. Moments like Venezuela do not overturn the order. They clarify it. They remind all participants that legitimacy, while important, does not substitute for logistics, presence, and sustained reach. Understanding this distinction is essential for interpreting future crises without illusion or outrage. It grounds expectations in reality rather than aspiration. The final lesson of this episode lies not in judgment, but in projection. What matters now is how states adapt their strategies in response to what has been revealed. The question is not whether global influence will continue to shift. It will. The question is how responsibly that shift is managed during the transition. Power that expands faster than its support systems invites instability, both externally and internally. Power that consolidates patiently builds resilience. Venezuela underscored this choice with stark simplicity. Ambition alone does not generate leverage. Presence without protection creates expectation gaps. These gaps, once visible, shape the calculations of allies and rivals alike. For audiences seeking clarity rather than spectacle, this is the core insight. Global power is not a binary condition. It is a gradient defined by reach, endurance, and credibility. States operate along that gradient, advancing in some areas while lagging in others. Misrating one position for another leads to miscalculation. The most dangerous phase is not weakness, but transition. History shows that rising powers face their greatest risks when testing limits before infrastructure is ready. Restraint during such moments is not surrender. It is often strategic preservation. The future will bring new crises in different regions under different pretexts. Each will test assumptions about protection, partnership, and response. Observers should watch less for declarations and more for movement, less for rhetoric and more for logistics. Those indicators rarely make headlines, but they determine outcomes. Venezuela will not be remembered solely for what happened there. It will be remembered for what it revealed elsewhere. The gap between ambition and capability remains the defining variable of global politics. How that gap is managed will shape stability more than any single decision. The international system does not announce its turning points. It exposes them quietly through moments when action is possible for some and impossible for others.